Newly released text messages in the Bryan Kohberger case in Iowa. He's, of course, accused in the stabbing death of 4 University of Idaho students. This happened back in November of 2022. And the court has now released or unsealed some of the chilling words of those surviving roommates the night of the murders.
Joining us now, Court TV legal correspondent Kelly Craft. Kelly, fill us in. This is every day it seems like we're getting more and more out of this case.
Yeah, we sure are, Ted. Good afternoon to you and Julia. Bombshell evidence coming out in this case. This is for the first time we are seeing transcripts of these texts, and it's really giving us a true feeling of the real horrifying event that was taking place that night. The night Maddie Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were murdered. The 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, they start messaging one another about not being able to reach their other roommates, and then they start panicking quickly. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of those text messages. We've put them up on the screen for you. You can see that they are expressing fear, saying no one is answering. I'm really confused. And what's going on? So you can take a look at those messages. Somebody is telling each other, they're saying, run, come down here. And then 6 hours later, Dylan tries to reach Kaylee as well as Maddie. So you're taking a look at some of the other text messages there that they were exchanging. Now, we did get a glimpse of these yesterday because this is when they were first posted to the docket, although there's been talk about them over the last several months. So terrifying for the students that were in there, and this court filing in general really sheds light on the time frame, which is so important for prosecutors in a case like this, to get that timeline established. Ted and Julia?
It really is, Kelly, and that's terrifying just to know what was happening inside of that room. I think I was shocked that it took so many hours before they even realized that their friends were deceased, and for 911 to get there, they only responded just for Xana because that was the first friend that they were realizing was not responding, and they thought maybe she was unconscious. What can you tell us from this court filing? What else are we learning now that this is being unsealed?
So we're also seeing a newly revealed transcript of the 911 call made the morning. This is 7 hours after the murders. Let's go ahead and take a look at part of that. We have this transcript of it. So you can see that it says one of our roommates passed out. That's what they're thinking, that somebody has passed out. And she was drunk last night. She's not waking up. And they saw some man in their house last night. Yeah, at one point you hear the 911 caller, the 911 operator saying to them, stop passing around the phone because there's other people that are getting on the phone call to explain what's taking place. And they're asking eventually, talking about law enforcement. And so that's why the prosecutors say this is also so important, because they're not just calling for medical help, they're letting authorities know that there is something really off going on inside that residence.
Mm-hmm. It's the set of events is so bizarre. The time it took, and then the fact that they were all they didn't know what to do. They were obviously in shock, passing that phone around at the 911. What about the families? Every day they're hearing more, and I know it's been a very difficult road, obviously, for them.
Oh, certainly, Ted. And they always are posting comments to the latest court filings on Facebook. So the family of Kaylee Goncalves, they put out a statement. This was on Facebook after these texts were released. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at that? So reading some of the transcripts, documents that have recently been released has been essentially hard on all of us. We need this to be over. God help us all. So just new developments there in this case, and the statement from the family, as well as prosecutors are just working to get their case together because it's going to be a big one.
Yeah, Kelly Craft, thank you. Dwayne Cates is with us. He's a defense attorney in Phoenix, Arizona. Dwayne, the defense wants these text messages out. They're motioning for the court to not allow them in, saying that they are hearsay and that the jury doesn't need to hear it. The prosecution obviously wants them in, not only for the fear factor, but also to establish a timeline. What's your take in terms of this defense motion to exclude these text messages between the surviving roommates?
Well, we talk to get them excluded because 911 calls are generally exceptions to the hearsay rule in that they're excited utterances. And so they generally will come in. Now, I get that they're not horribly relevant to to whether this defendant committed this crime. Okay, because there's no identifying stuff. They said there was a man in the house that night. That's basically the extent of the identifying information. So I don't think it's horribly relevant, but they get it in because 911 calls almost always come in.
Dwayne, you raise a good point. There's another motion that the defense has where they are objecting to this identification from one of the eyewitnesses to a man with bushy eyebrows. And they're objecting to that descriptor of bushy eyebrows because it was used by police to look at the license plate picture of Bryan Kohberger, determine if perhaps he could be their suspect, even though they didn't have a lot at the time to go on. But your thoughts on if they'll be successful in trying to keep that identification out, which is more specific than a man being inside with a ski mask on?
Yeah, that probably comes in. I mean, it is relevant, okay, and it's what a witness saw, okay, and generally speaking, if what a witness saw is relevant to the case, then it usually comes in. Now, it's not an identification of Bryan Kohberger. It's an identification of bushy eyebrows, which thousands and thousands of people have, but it is one component of identifying the defendant.
Another defense motion is to exclude the death penalty because Bryan Kohberger apparently has been at some point in his life, or maybe now, has been diagnosed with a form of autism, saying that he, because of his condition, should be exempt from the death penalty or being exposed to the death penalty in the state of Idaho. Is that on some level an admission here? Or, I mean, I get that the motion isn't a straight admission, but what's your take on that motion, and do you think it'll be successful?
That's that's important because in order to do the death penalty, it's got to meet certain criteria. And if you're below a certain IQ level, you have certain mental defects, there's a lot of things that go into deciding whether or not the death penalty is appropriate. And in a case like this, where there is a death penalty, where they're alleging the death penalty, the defense attorneys are obligated to file every possible motion they can. And if they don't, that could be seen as ineffective assistance of counsel. Wouldn't be surprised if he hasn't been evaluated by a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist to determine autism and the level of autism, where he's at on the spectrum and all that. And I think that's going to be important for a judge to consider whether or not to leave the death penalty on the table.
That's a really big question as we march ahead to this August 2025 trial date. I have another motion to ask you about, Dwayne, and I do want to point out, we've been digging through these newly unsealed motions because there's so many that have come out at once. Mm-hmm. Before, there were many that were filed under seal, and actually the judge admonished both parties, saying everything can't be filed under seal, it can't all be secretive. So that's why perhaps we are seeing more that has already been filed. But there's one, again, about the death penalty, where the defense wants to preclude it because the state has violated some discovery deadlines. They haven't disclosed what they needed to with regards to experts, and they're citing the Lori Vallow case in Idaho, saying that's why the death penalty got pulled from her case, because the state didn't meet certain disclosure deadlines, and rather than prejudice her, they marched forward to the trial without the death penalty. Do you think that could be a strong argument, especially with that precedent there in Idaho?
Well, absolutely. Every state has their own set of rules about what has to happen in a death penalty case, and there are specific separate rules for death penalty cases, and a violation of those rules can take the death penalty off the table. And if there's precedent for something that really recent, where the death penalty was pulled for a violation of the same rule, then that's pretty powerful for the judge.
The team, obviously, their goal, it seems, their major goal is to get him off of potentially of death row. They seem to be targeting a lot of their motions, especially as this has gone through, towards that goal. It is it is a very high bar, and it should be, to sentence somebody to death. But if you're going to conjure up a version of an event that might constitute the death penalty, I think a lot of people would argue that this is it. For very, completely helpless victims murdered by allegedly a deranged stranger. What's your overall take on the strength of the case from what we know now as we creep towards trial?
Well, you never know what's going to happen at a trial, but with regard to all these motions about the death penalty, once they put the death penalty on the table, it is mandatory that these attorneys file every possible motion they can to get off the death penalty. It's not discretionary. If there's even a scintilla of evidence for a motion, you got to file it. I mean, you just have to, because being a death penalty case, this case will be scrutinized for years and years and years by dozens and dozens of lawyers. And so they've got to do it. Now, with regard to the strength of the evidence, I mean, it's a pretty decent circumstantial case. The DNA evidence, I'm understanding there's some unknown people in the DNA, and there's mixtures, which gets really complicated. And that's a DNA expert's, job, is explaining these when there's mixed DNA and how well you can tell, who's who and who did what. And, and juries generally kind of glaze over with the really technical stuff. And, if they get an expert that says, hey, I looked at the DNA and it says that he did it, they're going to believe that. All the technical stuff, why that may not be true, is hard to get through to a jury.
Yeah, and one of the reasons likely that they changed the venue in this case because of all the publicity there in Latah County. Dwayne, thanks so much for that analysis. We'll, of course, continue to follow what is happening in the Kohberger case with our Kelly Craft throughout the day.